You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports in the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. Today, my guest is the author of Passion Isn't Enough, and it's a practical guide for nonprofit leaders. And that author is David Rhode. I'll show you the book real quick for those of you who are watching this live. I had a chance to check out the book, and David reached out to me wanting to be on the show, and I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to share some of your insight, David, both about the book, about the nonprofit sector, and a few relational stories that we have from our roots in Philadelphia. So, David, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
All right, it's a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, David, you've had a long career working in social good, starting out with one of my favorite sports, baseball. You did a lot of work helping young people get connected to the sport by getting their playing fields and equipment and other things that they need in order to play the game through an organization that you established. And then you moved on to some other social good enterprises, but I would love for you to start out talking about what drove you to this passion. And you found out that passion isn't enough, but what drove you to your initial passion to get involved in helping young people who wanted to play softball and baseball? And by the way, both my kids played that sport. I played baseball as a high schooler and a college player as well, and had a great time playing baseball. My kids played baseball. My son played at the University of Maryland, and my daughter is one of the all-time softball players at the University of Virginia. And so we love that sport. But I wanted to talk with you about why you saw that sport as a path forward for a lot of kids. And I know it was for me, but I'd love to hear your reaction to that question.
Well, Art, thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity to sit down and chat. I was coaching my kids in baseball at the time. I'm a sports junkie. I'll fully admit to that. And I was at a point in my career where I was looking to do something more meaningful, transition out of a more entrepreneurial opportunity in the for-profit sector and move into the nonprofit sector. And I really wanted to do something in the sport for good genre. And it just so happened that, you know, a couple things kind of conspired and collided at the same time. I was, as I said, I was coaching my own kids, and you see when you're doing that, your kids grow out of things, but you don't really have the heart to throw things out. They sort of just pile up in the corner of the garage or a closet. And then I came across a gentleman that was doing a project where he was donating baseball gloves for kids in Poland. And then he and I got together, and I founded the organization called Pitchin for baseball and softball. And he was my first board member. And then the organization just grew from there. And I really felt that, you know, kids needed the opportunity to play. I got so much personal benefit and growth out of being involved with sports, and especially team sports. There's so many lessons that come along with that. But, you know, baseball and softball are not inexpensive games to play, and that's a real barrier to participation. So I did a quick scan of the internet looking for organizations that were kind of filling this need of providing new and gently used equipment to kids and communities in need. And there really wasn't anything of that nature happening on a broad scale. And so I launched the organization, and it was right around the time of Hurricane Katrina. And we got involved. Our very first projects were in the Gulf Coast region. And it was such a powerful experience helping those communities kind of get back to a sense of normalcy and get those kids back on the field doing something that felt like something that was very familiar to them. And then the organization just took off and grew from there.
When you say took off, what do you mean when you say took off? Were you able to inspire other people to join you in that work, and how did you go about that?
Well, we really grew fundamentally through strategic partnerships. And so our first strategic partnership was with Little League International. Little League, the folks that put on the Little League World Series, they're the largest youth sports organization in the world. And that same founding board member that I mentioned had a relationship with that organization. And we sat down with Steve Keener, the then CEO of the organization, who's stepping down shortly from that position. And we explained kind of who we were and what we did and how we could get equipment from point A to point B. And Little League was in a real tough spot. They wanted to help all these communities that had been devastated by these natural disasters, but they didn't really have the infrastructure to do so. So we were really solving an important problem for them. And that was our first big partnership. But then we also found that there were Major League Baseball teams and the league itself really wanted to support the growth of the game. But this equipment stuff was difficult to sort of figure out. You know, like you have kids of different ages and need gloves of different sizes and left versus right and this versus that. And we had a warehouse, and we really had a means to kind of detail out what a given league needed. And we were able to match that sort of player by player and get them the equipment they needed. So we ended up working with more than a dozen Major League Baseball teams and a number of equipment manufacturers, and really were able to go from what was an idea of, using this organization as a platform to get kids playing the game to helping communities all around the United States and in over 100 countries around the world. We, at the time I left the organization, we had helped about 1 million kids gain access to the game. And it was truly both fun, to be along for that ride, but also meaningful in terms of the impact we were able to have on those communities.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. And so you did that, and then you left to...
Then I began a career in consulting. I had moved from the Philadelphia area up to New York City, where I am now with my family, and still wanted to be involved in the nonprofit sector. And during the time I had led Pitchin for baseball and softball, I had mentored and coached informally a few other nonprofit CEOs, and frequently found myself into conversation with wannabe founders of organizations and giving them guidance, and felt it came really naturally to me, and that my advice was really well received. And so I moved into consultancy, where I would focus my time and efforts on that kind of work. So my practice at .org, which is the name of my consultancy, is focused on CEO mentoring and coaching. And that's really where I feel like I have the most impact and most value to be able to. I've walked in those shoes. I know the challenges. I made some of the mistakes, and I learned from those. And I really feel like I can guide young leaders through that kind of journey.
.org. That's pretty interesting, how you came up with that name. But you're right. There are lots of organizations that are getting started or are going through different kinds of transitions, and they need advice and counsel on a whole host of issues in order to both survive in some cases, but also to scale their operations to a place where they could actually achieve the kind of impact they want. So having people who've experienced that be able to offer them that kind of advice and service, I can see how that's particularly valuable. I get calls all the time from organizations wanting to know, how can I do this? Can you find me a grant writer? And I have to explain to them, well, what else you want to do? What do you need a grant writer for? You may have an idea, but do you have an organization that can actually absorb the grant? So there's a whole host of issues. And I don't know if you know, but I also teach both at Columbia Universities in the School of Nonprofit Management, their master's program, and also I'll be teaching at the Indiana Lilly School of Philanthropy to their leadership PhD students. They call it the Doctors of Philanthropic Leadership program there. And it's interesting and really inspiring to see so many people now seeking formal education in this. But aside from the formal education, it's great that we can have people like you who can offer advice and counsel. And so you wrote this book, which I guess is chock full of ideas and thoughts based on your own experience and what you've also learned from others. Talk about what drove you to write the book, and let's get into it a little bit.
Yeah, well, and Art, we share the teaching bug. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania in their
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit, their School for Social Policy and Practice, and also within
Mm-hmm.
the Wharton School. And I have a great book I can recommend for your leadership class at Liberty.
Wonderful. I love that.
So when I decided to write this book on nonprofit leadership, it was really grew out of the fact that I'd had conversation after conversation with nonprofit leaders. And it didn't matter what part of the sector they were in. It didn't matter what geography they were in. And it really didn't matter that much in terms of their budget size. They were going through the same challenges. And when I would start one of these conversations, it was almost like one of these old married couples. Like they would start the sentence and I felt like I could finish it for them. So I realized that, the leaders that I was talking to is just a small sample of the leaders that are out there were running into the same problems. And my hypothesis was that most nonprofit leaders are running into these same challenges.
Yeah.
And so I really wrote the book as a practical guide for these individuals. 92% roughly of the nonprofits that are out there in our country have a budget of $1 million or less.
That's right.
So if you're an executive director, you are not atop of a big organization. There's a few people there. You're wearing a ton of hats. And in a lot of these situations, you might be doing things for the very first time and you need support. And so I took the book in a really structured way. The first 15 chapters deal with different topics and different elements of being a nonprofit leader. And I walk through them and I give them some practical solutions. And at the end of each chapter, there's some actionable next steps that they can do. And as you indicated, Art, I also talked to 22 experienced CEOs and subject matter experts during the course of writing the book. And their insights are also embedded in the book. So it's not just my perspective, although it's most of me. It's them as well. They're all throughout the book. And they were so generous with their time and their frameworks and their best practices are incredibly valuable.
Yeah, well, I noticed one of the leaders in the book was Kenny Holzman, who I've gotten to know through his work creating the Philadelphia Youth Basketball Organization. And the amazing story that he recounts. We want to go into that about how they were able to raise money for this amazing facility.
Yeah, well, Kenny is one of the superstars in the nonprofit sector. He's just brilliant, and I get if you're fortunate enough to be in his presence, you get smarter just by paying attention. So, in my conversation with Kenny, we were talking about fundraising, and he was in the middle of a capital campaign. They have a 100,000 square foot facility in Philadelphia, which is not just for basketball, but for a lot of education, other leadership stuff that's going on there. It's tremendous. But it was early days in their capital campaign, and he tells this story of the fact that he was going to the gym, and there had been a really sad event. There had been a death. One of their coaches passed and had kids that were left behind that were also members of this program. And somebody at the gym asked Kenny, like, "Hey, how you doing?" And he goes, "I'm not doing so well." And he goes in and tells the story of what happened. And the person said, "Hold on a minute." And so at that point, he tells the story of the fact that he gets somebody on the phone, and Alan Horowitz is, a sort of a legend in Philadelphia. If you've ever been to a Sixers game, his seats are like a couple seats up from the Sixers bench, and he's known as the sixth man, and he's always up and he's animated. But long story short was, as a youth, Alan also lost his father, and really could identify very closely with the loss that this child had experienced with their father, who was a member of Kenny's team. And so he made a leadership gift. He's a very successful real estate person, and he made a leadership gift that really catapulted their capital campaign, because his presence within the campaign validated the investment, validated the project, and other resources flowed in. And the point of the story is that many times when we're thinking about capital campaigns or major gifts, we look at what somebody's capacity is and think, well, they have this amount of money, either corporately or personally, they can make the gift. But it's not about capacity. It's about connection and relatability. And when somebody can really see themselves in your organization and feel that they are making a difference with their philanthropy, then you have a chance of unlocking those kinds of resources. So, it's until you get to sort of make those connections, then it just becomes theoretical gifts. But once you know somebody, those gifts become really possible. And Kenny's story was really powerful. And it's just an example of how the folks that I interviewed for the book, how their insights and their experience are brought into the various chapters that they are part of.
Yeah. So let's talk about the title of your book, because I think that also gives us an indication of something that we talk a lot about during the podcast, which is that organizations are led and driven by people who have enormous passion for a particular cause, and they're putting it all out there every day. And yet we also know that there are certain processes and practices and procedures that will give you a chance to succeed if you employ them, but will make it much harder to succeed if you don't. And so I suspect what you mean in that you have to have the passion, but you also must have some other things. What are some of the key other things that you believe drive success in nonprofit leaders? And what do you say? Where do you list that, I guess, in your book? I guess you catalog some of those things in your book.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, passion is fundamentally something that draws many of us into the sector. And that's perfectly understandable. And it's a reasonable expectation that somebody's going to give their professional life to this kind of work. They're most likely going to maybe make a little bit less money than if they were outside of the nonprofit sector. But there's other rewards and there's other reasons that people do this kind of work. But, passion is something that allows you to kind of connect with maybe your donors and staff and the mission of the organization. But you as a leader are required to be successful in so many different ways. So whether it's strategic planning or fundraising or board engagement or communications or team building and hiring and all of the things that go into the leadership toolkit, the likelihood that you have all of those skills and experiences when you are taking over the role, especially if you're early in your career, it's unreasonable that somebody would have all of that coming in. And so the book is really meant to identify what some of these different areas are and to give them, a framework, a thought process about how they could tackle some of these challenges if their organization and they are facing them, especially if they're facing them for the first time. But even if they've done them before, sometimes I've done strategic planning, but you don't know if you've done it well or right or this or that. So there's just a ton of perspective in there because there's a breadth of things that is really expected of the executive director of an organization. And so the staff looks to you for answers and you can't say, boy, I haven't done this before. They're expecting you to have all the answers and the board is expecting you to have all the answers and you don't always have somebody to talk to. So, and the book is sort of maybe meant to be like your secret weapon, potentially. You can kind of, even when we talk about books being kept on a shelf, I envision this book being in somebody's back pocket, don't leave home without it kind of a thing. And you can keep going back to it and you don't have to read it sequentially. You can go to the particular chapter that's the most meaningful for you in terms of where you might be stuck right now. And maybe reading that chapter gets you unstuck. And so it's really important for people to understand that there are resources out there and these things have been done time and time again by other leaders and other organizations. And they can kind of get some of that support as they try to address these challenges for their group.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the chapters now, building your plan, building your board, building your fundraising strategy, building your partnership portfolio, financial controls, youth programs, evidence-based, brand, communication strategy, AI capability. I know you did a lot of work with branding, with organizations in particular. I don't know how well organizations think about branding. I think that many of us may believe that, well, that's something we just turn over to a professional to handle for us, which is, I guess, somewhat true. But there's also a lot more that goes into building a brand, and I want you to talk about that a little bit for some of the people who might be listening.
Yeah, I mean, this is the topic that I teach at Penn is nonprofit branding, and I worked at Procter and Gamble, which is sort of the mothership of consumer packaged goods marketing, and where I got my marketing and branding lens, and I talk about the fundamental differences between the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector in terms of branding, and some of those differences, if we think about how we communicate about our organizations, there's three things which are present in the nonprofit sector which are really not present in the for-profit sector. um, and the first one of those is really people. People tell the story in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
You don't really walk around telling somebody else to buy Coca-Cola if you're an executive for the Coca-Cola team or on the Coca-Cola board of directors. I mean, you might, but that's not really going to move
No,
the
that's
needle
not going
for
to
you.
work it.
All of that messaging is centrally controlled through paid advertising
Yeah.
and your sales force and all of those things.
Yeah.
But in the nonprofit sector, especially for the majority of these organizations who have smaller budgets, they're not spending money on marketing and communication.
No.
So people really carry the story forward. And so our job as leaders is to make sure that our board and our staff and our volunteers have the right messages, have the right elevator pitch so they can communicate the impact to people they come in contact with, because that's, in a lot of cases, that's how the word spreads and that's how we build our community.
Hmm.
It's also important to have proof. Proof is the other. So there's four P's in the nonprofit sector. Plus, I'm sorry, there's four P's in the for-profit sector, and there's seven P's in the nonprofit sector. So the first one was people. The second one is proof. And proof is this whole notion of, measurement and evaluation. How do we know that
Hmm.
our programs are working? And if we can demonstrate to others that our programs are really having the intended impact, then we can tell a really powerful story and attract more resources.
Hmm.
There's not proof for like Campbell's soup, or there's not proof for like Ford Motors. Like, there's
Right.
brands and there's sort of like how you feel about them, but it's very different in the nonprofit sector. So we
Hmm.
rely on
Yeah.
people, we rely on proof. And then the third one is process. Sometimes, and this is not the case for every organization, but in some cases, how we deliver our services is really meaningful and sort of tells our story. The way we did things at Pitchin for baseball and softball, how we got equipment from our warehouse to these communities in need all around the world was really impressive and really helped people understand that our organization had this wherewithal to do things that they didn't imagine when they would maybe see it our website or things of that nature. So for many organizations, the process is another way of kind of elevating their brand. So, we brand our organizations very differently than in the for-profit sector. And the other side of branding is really just consistency over time, not jumping all over the place and changing how you go about things. You really have to tell a message over the long haul in order for people to understand it and for it to sort of sink in. And so branding is the long game. And you're not going to see immediate results if you do a rebrand or this, that, and the other thing. These things kind of take years to kind of have a meaningful impact. So it's
Hmm.
sort of like turning around, an aircraft carrier. Like it really takes time for you to move your brand meaningfully one direction or the other. And so it's important for people to have that perspective.
David, you've been doing this for a while, as we said, and you just mentioned how you left corporate America. What's kept you though in the nonprofit space?
I don't know. I feel like we want me personally, everybody is in this for different reasons. I wanted to look back and feel like I made a difference in the world. And maybe that sounds like self-serving or grandiose, but we got one shot at things in this lifetime. And if I was going to invest my time professionally, that was important to me. That's part of my makeup. And it really enabled me to kind of do things and experience things and grow and feel like I was making an important difference. So the longer I stayed, the more impact I felt like I was personally having, and so that has sustained itself. And so as long as that's still happening, then I'm gonna stay with it.
Do you feel that young people today understand this idea of it takes a long time to really create meaningful impact? Or is your sense, even from some of your students, that people are looking at this as, I'm going to go out and in 2 years, we're going to change the world? I mean, what's your sense of that? Or is it somewhere along the scale there?
My guess is there's a certain naivete in terms of what's possible in the short term, but I don't think the sense of optimism or idealism is a bad thing. I think
Yeah.
I probably had an unrealistic sense for what I could accomplish when I got into the sector. I could tell you that I did. I got
Yeah.
there. The first couple of years took a lot longer, and then it was not linear. Once we hit a certain level of momentum, then things really took off. But in the
Yeah.
beginning, it's hard, and you got to fundraise, and you got to
Yeah.
there's only so many. Your friends and family are only going to give you so much support. Then they're going to start
Right.
crossing the street when they see you. So you have to find and make this a sustainable business model. And I think one
Yeah.
thing that people don't understand fully, and this is sort of maybe this is really what's behind the book and behind your question, is running a nonprofit organization is running a business. And
Yeah.
so in order for your business to succeed long term, you need a business model. You need to be able to track resources, people, and money. And you need to be able to make a meaningful difference. You need to be able to prove to people that you are having a distinct impact in your community. Because if there's 6 organizations involved with food insecurity and you're the 7th organization, you're doing roughly the same thing, what's the point? Like,
Yeah.
it's not that food insecurity shouldn't be addressed. It's like, but other people are also addressing it. Why are you addressing it too? Like, what are you doing differently than them? And I think this
Hmm.
sort of gets to the branding question and to some other questions. Is you really need to understand like what it is that your organization is going to do that's different and better than others, so that you're adding value to the sector and the community, and not just competing for the same resources that others might be struggling to attract for themselves.
How does your book talk about collaborating? Because I know that's one of the different challenges that nonprofits may have compared to business. Although, businesses sometimes collaborate with each other, as we see with maybe pharmaceutical companies on basic drug compounds. But if you were to think about nonprofits, I happen to believe that one of the biggest untapped assets that we have is that we could collaborate more. But what's your book say about that?
Well, there's 2 types of collaboration that come to mind for me. The first is really partnership development, and that is
Mhm.
when nonprofit organizations partner with potentially corporations and other
Mhm.
entities that have the same desire to make an impact, and there's alignment around the values between what the corporation wants to achieve in the community and what the nonprofit wants to achieve in the community. And so I think that that's one fundamental way that collaboration can and should happen.
So we call
Um,
those corporate
those are
partnerships.
corporate partnerships or
Mhm.
strategic partnerships, and those are
Mhm.
valuable, but they take time. And I get into excruciating depth in chapter 4 about that. That was an area where I
Mhm.
have a ton of experience. And then Joe
Mhm.
Waters, who is one of my contributors, is one of the experts in the field. Joe's impact on that chapter has been tremendous. And so we talk about that. The other type of collaboration that you're talking about is how nonprofit organizations can work with each other. And I don't get into that as much in the book, but I think it is a very insightful point, Art, and something that we did as Pitchin for baseball and softball, which is we kind of were in our lane of equipment. Now, we knew
Mhm.
there were other challenges for kids playing
Mhm.
baseball and softball. They needed fields. We didn't help with fields. They needed
Mhm.
coaches. We didn't help with coaches. But we knew who did. And so if people came to us with some of those challenges, we could point them to other organizations and say, I think that these folks can really help you. Here's where we can help. We're going to stay in
Mhm.
our lane, but these other folks are really good at these other things. And so I
Mhm.
think if you are in the sector in a meaningful way, you're going to know the other organizations that have services which complement yours. And you don't always need to have those services within in-house, because that sometimes just spreads your organization even thinner. Maybe the right way is to do what you're saying, which is collaborate with other organizations. You can collaborate on grant requests, you can collaborate in other ways, and then attract resources and work together to have the impact you're trying to have in the community.
One of the things I think about from a leadership standpoint is having the ability to generate and sustain positive energy and momentum. And do you offer any thoughts about how important that is, or how you generate that, or how you do it?
Well, I think we as leaders need to be optimistic. We need to set a culture and a tone for the organization. If people look at us and how we model our, if we're always complaining about this or worrying about this, then the organization's going to be down and the
Hmm.
organization is going to be worried and people might feel like their jobs are at risk. So I think we as leaders need to be really mindful of how we carry ourselves and the message that that sends and how that permeates the culture of our organization. Um, and so I think that we as leaders have to just be aware of that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and because I think that that can have a tremendous ripple effect if things are not being modeled properly, and it could have a tremendous ripple effect on the positive side if we are helping people understand, hey, I know this thing happened, but here's the good news: we've got these other ideas and these other funders and these other initiatives. So we're not relying on that one funder. We're not relying on this one program. That's a
Hmm.
setback, but that's okay. Setbacks happen, and just
Right.
show people and sort of teach people resilience, teach people creative problem solving. I think resilience is one of the fundamental things that people need to be successful in life, let
Yeah.
alone in the nonprofit sector. But in the nonprofit sector, you
Probably especially
get
so.
punched in the nose once in a while, and like, how are
All
you
the
going to deal
time.
with it? What
All
what
the
is the
time.
what is the old expression? Like, you can go into a fight, or Mike Tyson, like, you have a game plan, and everything falls
Until
apart
you get hit.
until somebody punches you in the nose. Well, I really butchered that expression, but the point is, like,
Yeah.
you can have a plan as a nonprofit organization, but you're going to stumble. There's going to be
Yeah.
roadblocks, and that should be, you shouldn't treat those as the exception. Like,
Yeah.
that's just part of life. That's part of work. That's part of our challenge. And having a resilience, a culture of resilience within the organization is important. And I think we as leaders need to model that and need to just always have people. I think one of the things I talk about that feeds into this is not being afraid to share bad news. Like, if you
Yeah.
are in a meeting with going over your budget, and let's say your development team knows that there's a gift that's not going to happen, or this, that, and the other, well, you need them to elevate that. And the
Hmm.
sooner they elevate that, the sooner you, as the leader, can help them think through, okay, that's fine. We were expecting
Hmm.
this money in August, but it's not going to come until October. And so then you can think about cash flow, and you can maybe work on a line of
Right.
credit or other things if things are that tight, and manage and plan. But I think one of the things we need to do is make sure we don't shoot the messenger,
Yeah.
and you want people to really feel comfortable coming to you with challenges, coming to you with things that maybe didn't go to plan, so that you can help them because you've got more experience, and you can then maybe give them some ideas about how they can navigate, and then they can become a better problem solver and a better manager, and a stronger member of the team. And so you really want to make sure people understand that and are really willing to share bad news in a timely fashion without judgment or blame, so that you can help them navigate through it.
Well, David, I have to say, I agree with that wholeheartedly. But it also sounds like you're now bleeding passion into other areas that, kind of point to how you operate from a procedure and process standpoint. Because I believe what I'm hearing from you is that this is something that leaders have to build into how they operate. And if it's not who you are necessarily, you can learn it, you can apply it, you can develop it, right? And you can practice it, even though it may not be essentially who you are. And it's essential to the success of the organization. So there are some of these things that are born out of passion that we may not display often enough. And we need to, because they do drive, I think, others to be more supportive and interested and willing to extend themselves in ways that may not always make sense. And see, that's the other part of nonprofits, right? I mean, nonprofit organizations, if you were purely logical, shouldn't even exist. Because if you think about what you're asking people to do, you're saying, we have an idea for how to fix a really hard problem. We don't have any money necessarily. We don't have any staff or anybody necessarily to help us, but we're going to do this. So if you were to drive that through a business plan, right, a hard-nosed for-profit business plan, they'd look at you and say, well, where's the money coming from? What's the product you're selling? What are all these things? But yet without all of that, we go ahead and start these things, right? And then it sort of comes together, but that's based on a passion. And then once it comes together, we got to start employing those business practices, right? And maybe businesses are the same. I don't know. But I think about these things, and I'm just curious what your reaction is.
There's a lot of, I mean, think about Bill Gates working out of his garage. Like
Right.
this is there's every pizza box cliche in the
Yeah.
world,
Yeah.
like how people bootstrap at the early days of
Mhm.
startups. And so I don't think a nonprofit startup necessarily is a lot different. Maybe the cash burn and some other
Yeah.
and the exit strategies are different. There's not a financial exit strategy in the
Yeah.
nonprofit sector. So we're not looking for the same kind of return.
Yeah.
But I mean, things are hard in the beginning, and people have to, people have to buy into the vision of
Yeah.
what you're trying to accomplish. So you're not going to have results in the early days. You're really trying to tap into people's understanding that you understand the problem and you have a
Mhm.
way of fixing it. And
Yeah.
so if they can see those things, then they're willing to, as a bit of an act of faith in the beginning, support the work you're doing. And then your responsibility is to sort of fill in the blanks and say, now it's not just faith. Now we're a couple years
Yeah.
into it. We're able to have measured the impact. And here's some proof. Here's some either anecdotes, and even better yet, here's some objective measures. We've measured these kids at X and Y and Z before they started our program. And then at the
Mhm.
end of the school year or at the end of the whatever, we've measured them again and look at the progress they're making. And so, our job is to kind of like paint the picture and do that in a way that does help people understand that we can get to where we're trying to go. And so that to me is a big part of leadership is kind of be able to, be a bit of a visionary for the organization and then attract others who are going to become brand ambassadors and feel that same passion. And then they're all attracting resources, and then the organization can be lifted up.
Yeah. Well, David, we're at time, but I just wanted to just thank you. We're listening to David Rhode, who has written this really, I think, full book full of ideas and thoughts for how nonprofit leaders can thrive. It's called Passion Isn't Enough. I'll show it to you again. And I know that for those of you who are studying this field or who just want to have a guide for how you can operate, I think this would be very helpful for you. And David, I just again want to thank you and congratulate you for completing the book and for all the great work you've done and are doing. And I want to say to anyone listening to this for the first time, this is the Heart of Giving podcast. It is a weekly show. We come on every Tuesday with a new episode. I hope you will subscribe. And if you do want to support the podcast, you can do that by making a donation at give.org. So I hope we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.